The California sun was just breaking on the horizon as Mike finished his run. Mike was 22 and today would be his last day serving in the United States Air Force. The previous day he cleaned out his desk and packed out his things to have shipped back to Georgia. He had a flight out of the Los Angeles airport scheduled for 9 p.m. that evening headed to Georgia. Mike returned to his quarters, took a shower and put on his uniform for what would be the last time. Then walked to the dining room for some breakfast and coffee. Once he finished, he went back to his quarters and packed up what remained of his things and walked out of the room he had called home for the previous 18 months. Stopping by the main office, he briefly spoke to the man in the office. Turned in his used blankets and bedding. Then handed the man the room key. "I am going to miss you, Mike," the man said. "I met some great people here," Mike said. The man said, "I was told to have you to wait, and when you were ready, I was to call your orderly room and they would have you picked up." "Okay," Mike said, and he took a seat. About 10 minutes later a Ford Fairmont staff car arrived and Mike placed his things in the trunk and got in. The man drove to Mike's squadron and parked. Mike got out and was told to keep his things in the car. Both men walked inside and sat in the orderly room. "Are you squared away?" asked the first sergeant, inviting Mike back to his office. "Mike, I need to have you sign this form. Since you have a security clearance, this form says you can be sent to prison for talking about any classified information. This means 20 years from now, understand?" Mike said, "Yes, sir," and signed the form. Then the man stood up and said, "The colonel wants to speak to you before you head over to CBPO and get your 214. Mike got up and followed the first sergeant into the commanding officer's office. That meeting was brief, and Mike walked back to the car and the driver took him to CBPO and he walked into the back where he was given a lot of information about his veterans benefits and signed his 214. The first stop was accounting and finance, where Mike received his final pay and his travel money. Then they drove to the base travel office where Mike was handed his ticket home. By this time, it was about 10 a.m. and Mike went to pass an ID to get his limited ID card because he was going on terminal leave. Then they collected his old ID card. By 2 p.m. Mike was on the road to the airport and was thinking about home. It had been 2 years since he was last in Georgia and was also eager to see Terri. Terri was 23 and in her first year as an elementary school teacher. The last letter Mike got from her, she told him she was waiting for him and wanted to rekindle their relationship. It was December of 1980 and Mike was surprised to see the new Atlanta terminal building. When he stepped out of the jetway, he saw Terri and his parents standing waiting. Mike hugged Terri and his mother and shook his dad's hand. Then they walked to baggage claim. As Mike's dad drove the car out to Interstate 85, Mike looked at his watch and could see it was almost 5 a.m. and he was getting a bit hungry. Mike's dad said he wanted to get out of the Atlanta metro area and would stop to get breakfast. As they drove up the highway, Mike started to notice they were leaving the metro area and were approaching the Boggs Road exit signs and knew they were out of the metro area. Then he could start to see the morning sun. They drove about another 20 minutes and finally stopped. That day, after getting to his hometown, Mike made some phone calls and over the next few days started to reconnect with his old friends. A few nights later, Mike was sitting with Terri in a local restaurant, and she asked Mike what his plans were. Mike told her he had already been accepted to the engineering program at Georgia Tech and had until that next fall to get his financing done. Terri was somewhat upset he did this without talking to her first. Terri's dad had told her he could get Mike hired where he worked, and he could also go to night classes. Mike had told her many months before that he was not going to accept that job offer and wanted to attend Georgia Tech. He explained to Terri the conversation he had with Air Force Staff Sergeant Bruce, his recruiter, about the GI benefit he would get after serving. He would then be able to fulfill his dream of becoming an engineer and get some veterans benefits. The day Sergeant Bruce was at his high school when he was a senior along with several other recruiters giving the seniors the armed service battery of tests. Mike finished and walked into his school commons area and was about to buy a Coke when Sergeant Bruce offered to buy him a Coke. They sat and discussed the Air Force and how much it would benefit him. Sergeant Bruce told him he could start getting some college classes at night and, in a few years, might even be able to get a commission as an Air Force officer. As Mike listened to Sergeant Bruce talk about the GI Bill, Mike became interested because he knew in his heart he wanted to go to Georgia Tech, but also knew his family did not have the money. So, after Mike graduated from school, he called Sergeant Bruce in Athens, Georgia, and Sergeant Bruce made an appointment with Mike to get the 1966 forms filled out. By the fall of 1976, Mike was on his way to Lackland Air Force Base. Now that his hitch was over, Mike had to start the process of activating his GI Bill. As the summer of 1981 dragged on, Mike started to notice Terri was not herself, but he knew she was disappointed because he was delaying marriage. That fall, Mike moved to the Georgia Tech campus and started school. He had also got a job at one of the local restaurants, bussing tables and washing dishes. Mike had every other weekend off, so he got in his old 1962 Volkswagen Bug and drove home. So, for the rest of that year and into the summer of the next year, Mike followed that schedule. Mike had met Terri through her brother Don. Don and Mike were high school classmates and best friends. Don was the last person he expected to see sitting near the entrance of his dorm. Mike smiled at Don and said, "What's up, Don?" Mike could tell by the look on Don's face something was wrong. Mike's first thought was somebody had died. "Mike, we need to go somewhere and talk. I am not going to lie to you, but you are not going to like what I must tell you." Don was almost crying as he said those words. Mike had Don follow him to a table close by and they sat, and Don started. "Mike, Terri called in sick, and the school brought in a substitute teacher. She then left with a group of people and drove up to Gatlinburg. Mike, do you remember Robert Walls?" Mike nodded his head and started to feel sick. Mike, Terri spent the weekend with Robert, and yes, they slept together. "Mike, I wanted you to hear this from me. Also, Mike, my folks asked me to tell you to stay away from Terri. I am sorry, and right now I am so angry at Terri I could choke the life out of her." Mike almost passed out. He got up and just started walking. He missed all his classes that day. Mike walked until well into the late afternoon. Several times he stopped and vomited. That night, weak from hunger and an emotional mess, Mike stood in the shower crying. That previous Thursday night, Terri decided that enough was enough. She wanted to marry Mike, have his kids and live a happy life. She was not getting any younger and Mike was delaying marriage again. For years she had waited. Mike spent those years in California. "Screw Mike," Terri finally said. She had been nice to Robert Walls, but this weekend she was going to give him her virginity and rub it in Mike's face later. She agreed to go with him and some friends. She did not find the enjoyment she craved. By the time Robert dropped her off at her apartment she shared with another teacher, she was depressed. By late Sunday night she had called her mother and told her what she had done. Because Don lived closer to Mike, her mom called him and told him what Terri had done. Because she was so angry and embarrassed by Terri's actions, she told Don to tell Mike to stay away, because she could not bear to see Mike's face. Over the following months Mike was called into a meeting to discuss his future at school. Slowly Mike started to recover. Then Don called him and asked Mike to meet him at the varsity. There Don told Mike Terri was pregnant. Mike was dizzy, but he recovered enough to thank Don. Several years later Mike had graduated and found a job working for a large Atlanta-based company. After Terri, Mike knew he would never trust another female enough to marry her. Terri had her daughter and married another man after Robert dumped her. Robert could not hold a job long enough to make child support payments on time. After several years she just gave up. Robert was killed on a job site when his daughter was 10. Terri's marriage fell apart, and she found herself a single mother of 2. Every time she had holiday meals with Don she would ask about Mike. Don would be nice, but tell her Mike is doing okay and is a closed subject. By 1995 Mike was in upper management and doing well. He had some romances, but really would never allow the girl into his heart, and over time she would find other men. For almost 20 years Terri attempted to get Mike to talk to her. A friend of both Terri and Mike had a party scheduled and invited Mike and did not tell him she had also invited Terri. When Mike saw Terri, he left never to speak with that friend again. In 2011 Mike retired and started his own business. He also moved from Georgia to Virginia. For the next few years Mike was working on contracts all over the world. Then one day he met Amanda. Amanda was an attorney and recently divorced and had just left her job with a Virginia Commonwealth attorney. Because neither of them was interested in marriage, they hit it off. Then one day Don called Mike and asked him if he would consider returning to Georgia. Don then told him his sister Terri had metastatic breast cancer and it was terminal. Terri wanted to talk to him. Amy and Mike spoke for several days, and she talked Mike into going. She could not go because she had court cases. Mike drove over to the airport where he kept his Cessna 182 and flew to Gainesville, Georgia and rented a car. Mike had been invited to Christmas dinner. By this time Terri's dad had passed away. He had several days, so he took a drive to the Georgia Tech campus and walked around. Over the years there have been a lot of changes. He did find the area where Don first told him about Terri. By now all the old tables had been removed and all that was there now was grass. Mike knew several classmates that were now teaching. He found one and they had lunch. Then Mike rented a room for the night. Finally, it was Christmas of 2021. Mike slowly drove up where Don and his wife lived on Lake Burton. All three of Terri's children were there. Mike saw Terri's mom. She walked out and hugged him, as did Don and his wife Donna. Mike shook Terri's hand. Because of the COVID situation and how weak Terri's body was, she was wearing a mask. Mike finally asked Terri if she was up to walk to where some tables were set up. They walked and talked. Mike did take Terri's hand as they walked. As they talked, Terri told Mike what happened that weekend decades ago. She also asked Mike to forgive her. Mike looked at Terri and said, "Terri, it was hard dealing with what happened. Over time I just concluded you and I were never meant to be. In those days I forgave you. You can be proud of those kids you brought into the world." Terri said, "Yes, I am." Then she said, "I know Don will be there for them after I am gone." Mike then walked beside Terri and took her hand, and they walked back. 3 months later Don called Mike and told him Terri had peacefully passed in her sleep. Her kids were next to her. Mike told Amy Terri had died and they later had dinner. Mike chose not to attend her funeral. As Mike thought about the events, he come to realize how much he hated people that were cheaters.